The ancient laws of the Silver Peak realm were written in blood and enforced by fear. At the top stood the Alpha King, absolute in power and judgment. Below him, warriors, nobles, the privileged few, and at the very bottom, so low they barely registered in the hierarchy, lived the Omegas. Omegas had no voice in pack decisions, no right to challenge their fate, and absolutely no claim to an Alpha King's attention, even if the fates themselves declared them mates. That's what made Fidelia's situation so impossible. Standing in the Alpha King's private study, she felt the mate bond burning in her chest like a brand. It had snapped into place 3 days ago during the full moon ceremony, that unmistakable pull that said mine in a language older than words. She'd felt it. He'd felt it too. She'd seen the recognition flash in those jade-green eyes before his expression had shuttered closed like iron gates slamming shut. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. Now, Alpha King Snow sat behind his massive oak desk, every inch of him radiating controlled power. He was devastatingly handsome in that dangerous way alphas often were, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell just past his collar and a face carved from granite and shadow. A thin scar cut through his left eyebrow, a reminder of battles won. Everything about him screamed dominance, from his predatory stillness to the way the air itself seemed to bend around him. He didn't look at her. Hadn't looked at her since she'd entered. "You understand why you're here," he said, his voice deep and emotionless. Fidelia's hands trembled, so she clasped them behind her back. "Then you understand that this bond," he said the word like it tasted bitter, "is impossible. The fates don't make mistakes. The fates." Snow interrupted, finally lifting his gaze to hers. "Didn't consider politics. You're an Omega. I need a Luna who can command respect, who can stand beside me in war councils and treaty negotiations. Someone with strength, lineage, power." His jade eyes were cold, analytical. "You have none of those things." Each word landed like a physical blow. Fidelia had known this was coming, had known from the moment the bond formed that he would reject it. Reject her. But knowing didn't make it hurt less. "I'm stronger than I look," she said quietly. "Strength isn't just physical." Snow stood, and the movement was liquid grace and restrained violence. He crossed to the window, putting distance between them. This realm has enemies on every border, internal factions waiting for any sign of weakness. If I take an Omega as my Luna, they'll see it as exactly that weakness. They'll strike. So you'd rather reject your fated mate than risk appearing weak? I'd rather keep my people alive." He turned back to her, and for just a moment, something flickered in his expression. Regret, maybe, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "I'm not doing this to hurt you, Fidelia. I'm doing this because I have no choice. There's always a choice. Not for kings." Snow moved closer, and Fidelia's wolf whimpered at his proximity, desperate to close the distance, to complete what the fates had started. "I, Snow Blackthorn, Alpha King of the Silver Peak realm, formally reject the mate bond between us. You are released from any claim, any obligation. You're free." The words hit like silver through the heart. Fidelia gasped as the bond began to tear, a wrenching, burning agony that stole the breath from her lungs. Her wolf howled in anguish, clawing at her insides, fighting against the severance. She stumbled, caught herself on the edge of his desk, refusing to fall. Snow's jaw clenched, his knuckles white where he gripped the window frame. He felt it too, the pain of breaking something sacred. But he didn't take it back. "Do you accept the rejection?" His voice was rougher now, strained. Fidelia straightened slowly, blinking back tears she refused to let fall. She'd spent her entire life being dismissed, overlooked, told she wasn't enough. She'd be damned if she'd beg now. "I accept," she whispered. The bond shattered. Fidelia fell to her knees as the final connection snapped, leaving a hollow void where warmth had been. Distantly, she heard Snow's sharp intake of breath, saw him brace himself against the window, but when she looked up, He'd already composed himself. His face, an impassive mask, once more. "You'll be given a cottage in the outer village," he said, not looking at her. "Compensation for this situation. You're dismissed." Fidelia rose on shaking legs. She should leave, should walk away with what little dignity she had left. Instead, she met his eyes one last time. "You're right about one thing," she said softly. "You had no choice, but neither did I. And one day, you're going to realize what you just threw away." She turned and walked out of his study, her spine straight, despite the pain screaming through every nerve. Behind her, Snow stood frozen at his window, watching her go. One hand pressed to his chest, where the phantom bond still ached. He'd made the right choice. He had to believe that, even if it felt like he'd just ripped out his own heart. Fidelia woke to darkness and pain. The cottage they'd given her sat at the edge of the outer village, far enough from the palace that she'd never have to see Alpha King Snow again. It was small but sturdy stone walls, a thatched roof, a fireplace that worked, more than most Omegas ever received. It felt like a consolation prize for having her soul torn in half. 3 days had passed since the rejection. 3 days of bone-deep agony that no healer could touch. No medicine could ease. The severed mate bond was a wound that bled internally, invisible to everyone but her. She'd barely eaten, barely slept. Her wolf had retreated so deep inside her that Fidelia sometimes wondered if she'd ever surface again. But this morning, something was different. This morning, Fidelia was angry. She dragged herself out of bed, her legs weak but functional. Her reflection in the small mirror showed a ghost pale skin, hollow eyes, tangled auburn hair that hadn't seen a brush in days. She looked exactly like what the Alpha King had expected. A broken Omega, destroyed by rejection. Good, she thought with bitter satisfaction. Let him think he broke me. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Fidelia opened it to find Marin, an older Omega from the village, holding a basket of bread and preserved fruit. "You look terrible," Marin said bluntly, pushing past her into the cottage. "When's the last time you ate?" "I'm not hungry. That wasn't the question." Marin set the basket on the small table and turned to face her, arms crossed. "The whole village knows what happened. Rejected by the Alpha King himself. Most Omegas don't survive that kind of bond severance. I'm surviving. Barely." Marin's expression softened slightly. "Look, I'm not here to pity you. The moon knows we get enough of that. I'm here because I've seen what you're doing." Fidelia frowned. "What I'm doing? Giving up. Fading away like you're supposed to." Marin stepped closer, her voice dropping. "But here's the thing. I've been watching you since you arrived. You're not like other Omegas. You've got fire in you, even if you're trying to drown it. The Alpha King made it clear what I am, what I'll always be." "The Alpha King," Marin said with surprising venom, "is an arrogant fool who confused power with wisdom. He rejected you because you're Omega, without ever asking what that actually means, without ever wondering if maybe, just maybe, the fates knew something he didn't." The words struck something deep inside Fidelia, something that had been cowering in the dark since the rejection. "It doesn't matter what the fates knew," she said quietly. "The bond is broken. It's over." "Is it?" Marin tilted her head. "Then why do you keep touching your chest like something's still there? Why does your wolf keep reaching for a connection that supposedly doesn't exist anymore?" Fidelia's hand had unconsciously moved to her sternum. She dropped it immediately. Marin smiled knowingly. "Mate bonds don't die cleanly, girl, especially not bonds that strong. You felt it when it formed. That wasn't ordinary. That was fated, divine, meant. Those kinds of bonds don't just disappear because some king says pretty words. He rejected me. I accepted. That's how it works. That's how it's supposed to work." Marin moved to the door, then paused. "But the moon has a sense of humor about these things, especially when alphas get too big for their britches." She glanced back with a sly smile. "Eat the food, rest, and then ask yourself something. Are you going to let him define what you are, or are you going to figure that out for yourself?" She left before Fidelia could respond. In the palace, Alpha King Snow stood in the training yard, systematically destroying practice dummies with barely controlled violence. Your Majesty. His beta, Garrett, called from the edge of the yard. The council is waiting for you. The trade negotiations with the Western Pax. Tell them to start without me. Garrett hesitated. Your Majesty, they specifically requested your presence. The terms are complicated. I said, start without me. Snow's voice carried the weight of Alpha Command, and Garrett immediately bowed and retreated. Snow drove his fist into another dummy, relishing the impact, the pain in his knuckles, anything to distract from the constant ache in his chest. 3 days since the rejection, and the pain hadn't faded. If anything, it was getting worse. He'd done everything right, spoken the formal words, severed the bond cleanly. She'd accepted the rejection. He'd felt it. When she'd spoken those words, the bond should be dead. So why did he still feel her? It was faint, like an echo of an echo. But sometimes, in quiet moments, he could sense her emotions bleeding through whatever remained between them. Grief, anger, and underneath it all, a stubborn flicker of something that felt like determination. You looked like hell. Snow turned to find his younger sister, Lyra, leaning against the fence. She was one of the few people who could speak to him so casually, partly because she was family, partly because she was one of the deadliest warriors in the realm, and he respected her too much to pull rank. I'm fine. You're a terrible liar. Lyra pushed off the fence and approached. You rejected your fated mate 3 days ago, and you've been destroying training equipment ever since. That's not fine. It was necessary. Was it? Lyra circled him slowly. I've been hearing interesting things. Whispers about Omega bloodlines. Old magic that was suppressed centuries ago. Makes me wonder if maybe you rejected her because she's Omega, or if someone wanted you to reject her because of what Omega actually means. Snow's jaw tightened. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that the council pushed pretty hard for this rejection. Elder Marcus especially. For someone who's supposed to be your advisor. He seemed awfully invested in making sure you severed that bond before it could fully form. The council serves the realm. The council serves their own interests. Lyra's voice hardened. And they've been doing it for years, while you've been too busy playing the perfect, controlled king to notice. Maybe it's time you asked yourself why they were so afraid of an Omega Luna. She walked away, leaving Snow alone with his thoughts and the phantom ache in his chest. In her cottage at the edge of the village, Fidelia stared at the food Marin had brought. Her stomach growled traitorously. She picked up a piece of bread and took a bite, then another. By the time she finished, something had shifted inside her. The pain was still there, would probably always be there, but underneath it, something else was stirring. Marin was right. She'd spent 3 days being exactly what Snow expected. A broken, forgettable Omega, but she was done with that. If the Alpha King wanted her to disappear, he was going to be disappointed, because Fidelia had no intention of fading away. 2 weeks after the rejection, Fidelia made her first trip to the central market. She'd avoided it until now, knowing that the marketplace was where gossip flowed as freely as commerce. Everyone would know about the rejection. Everyone would stare, but she refused to hide any longer. She'd spent the past 2 weeks recovering, eating Marin's food, forcing herself to move even when her body screamed in protest. The pain hadn't disappeared, but she'd learned to function through it. Her wolf was still distant, still wounded, but occasionally, Fidelia felt her stirring a flicker of defiance that matched her own. The market square buzzed with activity. Vendors called out their wares, children darted between stalls, and the scent of fresh bread and roasted meat filled the air. Fidelia kept her head high as she moved through the crowd, acutely aware of the whispers that followed her. That's her, the one the king rejected. Poor thing. Surprised she's even still alive. Fidelia ignored them all, focusing on gathering supplies. She'd need fabric to repair her worn clothing, herbs for cooking, candles for the long nights. Simple things. Normal things. She was examining a bolt of cloth when the crowd suddenly shifted, conversations dropping to hushed murmurs. Fidelia looked up and her breath caught. Alpha King Snow stood at the far end of the market square, surrounded by palace guards. He was dressed more casually than she'd ever seen him. Dark leather pants, a simple black shirt, no ceremonial armor, but he was no less commanding. People instinctively moved out of his path, bowing their heads, clearing space. His jade eyes swept across the marketplace and locked directly onto her. The phantom bond flared to life, sharp and unexpected. Fidelia gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Across the square, she saw Snow's posture stiffen, his jaw clench. He felt it too. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Leaving only the two of them and the impossible connection that refused to die. Then Snow's beater, Garrett, murmured something, and the spell broke. Snow turned sharply away, continuing through the market as if she didn't exist. The dismissal stung worse than the rejection had. "Don't let it show," Marin's voice said quietly beside her. Fidelia hadn't even noticed the older Omega approach. "He wants you to look broken. Don't give him the satisfaction." Fidelia straightened her spine, forced her hand away from her chest. "I'm fine. I know you are." Marin smiled slightly. "But he doesn't. And that's going to drive him crazy." They continued shopping, and Fidelia did her best to appear unaffected. But she couldn't help tracking Snow's movement through the crowd from the corner of her eye. He'd stopped at a weapons vendor, examining a ceremonial dagger. His guards formed a loose perimeter around him, keeping the crowd at a respectful distance. He looked every inch the powerful Alpha controlled, distant, untouchable. But twice, she caught him glancing in her direction. "He's suffering too," Marin observed quietly. "Maybe not as badly as you, but he feels it. The bond that won't quite die." "Good," Fidelia said, surprised by the venom in her own voice. Marin laughed. "There she is, the Omega with teeth." They were heading toward the exit when a commotion erupted near the center of the square. A merchant was arguing loudly with a young Omega girl no more than 16, who'd apparently been caught stealing bread. "Thief!" the merchant bellowed. "Someone get the guards." The girl trembled, clutching the bread to her chest. "My brother is sick. He hasn't eaten in 3 days. Please, I don't care about your excuses." The merchant grabbed her arm roughly before Fidelia could think. She was moving. "Let her go." Her voice cut through the noise. The merchant turned, taking in her plain dress, her Omega scent. His lip curled. "This doesn't concern you, Omega. Go back to—" "I said let her go." Something in Fidelia's tone made him hesitate. She stepped closer, meeting his eyes directly, something Omegas never did. "How much for the bread?" 3 coppers. Plus damages for the theft. Here. Fidelia pulled coins from her small purse, part of the compensation Snow had given her. 5 coppers. For the bread and your trouble. The merchant snatched the coins, releasing the girl. "Fine, but keep your rabble under control." Fidelia ignored him, turning to the trembling girl. "Are you hurt?" The girl shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. Thank you so much. I didn't know what else to do. Go home to your brother." Fidelia pressed another copper into her hand. "Get him medicine from the healer. Tell them Fidelia sent you." The girl fled, clutching the bread and coin like treasures. Fidelia turned to leave and found Alpha King Snow standing 10 feet away, his jade eyes fixed on her with an unreadable expression. The crowd had gone silent. Watching, Snow took a step forward, then another. He stopped, just out of touching distance, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the cedar and winter rain scent that made her wolf whimper with recognition. "That was foolish," he said quietly. "Interfering in merchant disputes, drawing attention to yourself. She was a child. Someone had to help her, and it had to be you." Something flickered in his eyes. "You can barely afford to feed yourself. Then I'll go hungry." Fidelia lifted her chin. Some things matter more than survival. Snow studied her for a long moment, and she watched emotions war across his face, surprise, frustration, and something that looked almost like admiration. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "No," Fidelia agreed. "I'm not." She walked past him, her shoulder nearly brushing his, and felt the phantom bond surge between them like lightning. Behind her, Snow stood frozen, one hand pressed to his chest, where the ache had suddenly intensified to something almost unbearable. His beta approached cautiously. "Your Majesty, find out everything about her," Snow said quietly. "Everything, Your Majesty." That's an order, Garrett, because Snow was starting to realize that rejecting Fidelia might have been the biggest mistake of his life, and the bond that refused to die was making sure he'd never forget it. Fidelia couldn't sleep. The encounter in the marketplace had left the phantom bond raw and aching. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Snow's jade gaze fixed on her, felt the heat of his proximity, remembered the way his careful control had cracked just slightly when she'd walked past him. "You're not what I expected." The words played on repeat in her mind. She gave up on sleep near dawn, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders and stepping outside. The village was still quiet, morning mist curling through the streets like ghostly fingers. "Trouble sleeping?" Fidelia jumped. Marin sat on the stone wall bordering her cottage, looking entirely too alert for the early hour. "Do you ever actually sleep? Or do you just materialize whenever I need judging?" Marin laughed. "I heard about yesterday. The whole village is talking about how you faced down a merchant and the Alpha King in the same afternoon. Bold move. I didn't plan it. The best moments never are." Marin hopped down from the wall. "Come. There's someone you need to meet. It's barely dawn, which is exactly when we need to go." Marin's expression turned serious. They walked through the waking village, taking paths Fidelia had never explored. Eventually, they reached a small cottage tucked against the forest edge, nearly hidden by overgrown vines and ancient oak trees. Marin knocked 3 times, paused, then twice more. The door opened to reveal a woman who looked impossibly old and ageless at the same time. Her silver hair hung in intricate braids, and her eyes, one brown, one pale blue, seemed to see straight through Fidelia's skin to something deeper. "So," the woman said, her voice like wind through autumn leaves. "The rejected mate finally arrives. I wondered when Marin would bring you." "This is Iris," Marin said. "She's the oldest healer in the realm, and she knows things the palace would rather keep buried." Iris stepped aside. "Come in, child. We have much to discuss, and little time." The cottage interior smelled of dried herbs and old magic. Shelves lined every wall, filled with jars of ingredients Fidelia couldn't name. A low fire burned in the hearth despite the warm morning. "Sit," Iris commanded, gesturing to a worn chair. "Let me see the bond. It's broken. Nothing is ever truly broken, only transformed." Iris placed her palm over Fidelia's heart, and warmth spread through her chest. The healer's mismatched eyes widened slightly. "Extraordinary. The bond didn't sever cleanly. It's still there, dormant, damaged, but very much alive." "That's impossible," Fidelia whispered. "I accepted the rejection. We both felt it break. You felt it tear," Iris corrected. "But fated bonds, true bonds, blessed by the moon herself, those don't break like normal connections. They evolve." She released Fidelia and moved to her shelves, selecting various jars. "Tell me, has the Alpha King been distracted lately? Irritable? Unable to focus? I wouldn't know. I haven't seen him except in the marketplace yesterday," Marin supplied, where they both nearly collapsed from the bond flare. Iris smiled knowingly. "The bond is trying to repair itself, pulling you together whether you want it or not. But there's something else." She turned, her expression grave. "You're not just any Omega, Fidelia. Your bloodline carries old magic." "What are you talking about? 3 centuries ago, Omegas weren't the weakest of the pack. They were balancers, wolves blessed with the ability to amplify or dampen the power around them, to heal wounds both physical and emotional, to sense truth from lies." Iris began mixing ingredients in a clay bowl. The Alphas feared that power, so they suppressed it through generations of forced breeding and blood magic. They made Omegas weak by design. Fidelia's hands trembled. That can't be true." Why do you think the council pushed so hard for Snow to reject you? Marin asked quietly. Because they sensed what you are, what you could become if the mate bond fully formed. A true Omega, Iris said, grinding herbs with practiced efficiency. Bonded to an Alpha King, your suppressed abilities would awaken. You'd become his equal in power, able to challenge his commands, to see through political manipulation, to unite the packs in ways that threaten the council's control. She looked up, her mismatched eyes intense. They couldn't allow that. So they made sure he rejected you before you could fully bond. The cottage seemed to spin. This is insane. I'm nobody. I have no power. Don't you? Iris asked. Fidelia remembered the moment, the merchant's anger, the girl's terror. And underneath it, something else. A pull. An instinct that told her exactly what to say, how to diffuse the situation, where to stand, to project confidence she didn't actually possess. I thought that was just intuition. Intuition is magic for those who know how to listen to it. Iris held out the bowl, now filled with a silvery paste. This will help strengthen what remains of your bond, but I warn you, if you choose this path, there's no going back. Fidelia stared at the paste. Everything in her wanted to refuse, to stay small and safe and invisible like she'd been taught. But then she remembered Snow's words. You're not what I expected. Maybe it was time she stopped being what everyone expected. What do I do? She asked. Iris smiled. We begin your awakening. In the palace, Alpha King Snow stood before his council, barely hearing their endless debates about border patrols and trade routes. His chest ached. His wolf was restless, and he couldn't stop thinking about an Omega with fire in her eyes who'd walked past him like he was nothing. Elder Marcus was speaking, something about Omega management policies, but Snow interrupted. Tell me about Omega bloodlines. Silence fell across the council chamber. Your Majesty? Marcus asked carefully. Omega bloodlines, Snow repeated, his voice hard. What were they, before we made them what they are now? The elders exchanged nervous glances, and Snow knew, with absolute certainty, that they'd been lying to him for years. The training began at moonrise. Iris led Fidelia deep into the forest, to a clearing where ancient stones formed a perfect circle. Marin followed, carrying supplies wrapped in worn cloth. The council works hard to keep Omegas weak, Iris said, arranging candles at each compass point. They use fear, isolation, and carefully crafted beliefs. But belief is just another form of magic, and it can be broken. Fidelia stood in the center of the stone circle, her heart pounding. The silvery paste Iris had given her that morning still tingled on her skin, where she'd applied it over her heart. What exactly am I supposed to do? Stop thinking like prey, Iris said bluntly. Your entire life, you've been taught to make yourself small, invisible, submissive. Tonight, you unlearn all of it. I don't know how. Yes, you do. Iris lit the candles, and the clearing filled with flickering golden light. Close your eyes. Feel the bond. Damaged as it is, follow it to where it connects to him. Fidelia closed her eyes, reaching inward for the phantom ache that had haunted her for weeks. There, a thread of connection, frayed and thin, but undeniably present. And on the other end, Snow. She could feel him, his restlessness, his confusion, the way he kept touching his chest like she did, seeking something that should be gone but wasn't. Good, Iris murmured. Now push. Send your awareness through that connection. Let him feel you the way you feel him. Won't that hurt? Probably. Do it anyway. Fidelia gathered her courage and pushed her consciousness along the thread. It resisted at first, the damaged bond protesting the intrusion, but she pressed harder, and suddenly the connection blazed to life. Snow was in his private chambers, reviewing security reports, when agony lanced through his chest. He gasped, the parchment falling from his hands. The phantom bond that had been a dull ache for weeks suddenly burned white-hot, and through it he felt her, not just her presence, but her emotions, determination, fear, defiance, and underneath it all, a power that made his alpha instincts roar to attention. What is she doing? He pressed his palm to his sternum, trying to sever whatever connection had reformed. But the more he pushed, the stronger it became. And then he heard it, not words exactly, but impressions. Feelings that translated into meaning. I am not weak. You were wrong about me, about all of us. Snow stumbled to his window, breathing hard. Across the realm, somewhere in the darkness, Fidelia was reaching for him through a bond that shouldn't exist. And he couldn't stop it, couldn't block it, didn't entirely want to. In the clearing, Fidelia's eyes snapped open, glowing faintly silver. He felt that, she whispered, awed and terrified. Of course he did. Iris smiled with satisfaction. The bond is repairing itself, fighting to complete what the moon intended. But there's more. She gestured to the space around Fidelia. Look, the air itself seemed to shimmer with faint light threads of silver energy, connecting Fidelia to the stones, to the earth, to the candles, to everything. This is Omega magic, Iris explained. The ability to sense and manipulate the connections between all living things. Alphas have raw power, strength, dominance, command, but Omegas have something far more dangerous. Influence. You can't force submission, but you can inspire loyalty. Can't break bones, but you can heal wounds others can't see. Can't command obedience, but you can sense lies and reveal truth. The Council fears this, Marin added quietly, because an Alpha King with a true Omega mate becomes unkillable. She senses threats he can't see, heals damage he can't prevent, balances his aggression with wisdom. Together, they're unstoppable. Fidelia stared at the silver threads connecting her to everything around her. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel small. She felt dangerous. How long will it take, she asked, to fully awaken this power? That depends on you, Iris said, and on whether the Alpha King is smart enough to stop fighting the bond and start embracing what it's trying to tell him. Snow sent for Elder Marcus in the dead of night. The old counselor arrived, looking irritated at being summoned from sleep. Your Majesty, what's so urgent? You lied to me. Snow's voice was deadly quiet. About Omegas, about what they were before you made them weak. Marcus's expression shuttered. I don't know what you mean. Don't. Snow moved closer, his alpha presence flooding the room. I can feel her, Marcus. Through a bond you promised would die. And she's not weak. She never was. You just needed me to believe she was. Your Majesty, you're overwrought. Tell me the truth, or I'll have you stripped of your position by dawn. Marcus's facade cracked. You want truth? Fine. Yes, Omegas were once powerful. And yes, we suppressed that power because true Omega mates make Alpha Kings uncontrollable. They can't be manipulated, can't be guided by their councils, can't be kept in line. An Alpha King with a bonded true Omega stops being a king we can manage and becomes something we can't predict. His voice turned cold. That's why I made sure you rejected her. For the good of the realm. For stability. For your control. Snow corrected, his voice like ice. For order, Marcus snapped. Without the Council's guidance, without someone to check your power, you'd be no better than the tyrant kings of old. The Omega would whisper in your ear, cloud your judgment with emotions and sentiment. Get out, Snow said quietly. Your Majesty, get out, before I forget you're an old man and break your neck myself. Marcus fled. Snow stood alone in his chambers, the phantom bond burning in his chest, and made his decision. If the Council had lied about Fidelia, what else had they lied about? And more importantly, what was he going to do about the mate he'd rejected, who was quickly becoming the only person in his realm he could trust? Fidelia was returning from the forest training when the palace guards found her. Fidelia of the outer villages, the lead guard announced, his voice formal and cold. You are summoned before the High Council to answer charges of illegal magic practice and conspiracy against the realm. Her blood turned to ice. What? Resistance will be met with force. The guard's hand moved to his sword. Come peacefully, or we'll drag you. Marin appeared from a nearby cottage, her face pale. On whose authority? Elder Marcus, acting on behalf of the High Council. The guard's expression was impassive. The Alpha King has been informed. Fidelia's heart lurched. Snow knew. He'd either ordered this, or at minimum, allowed it. "I'll come," she said quietly, before Marin could protest further. "But I've broken no laws. The council will determine that." They escorted her through the village, and Fidelia kept her head high even as people stopped to stare. Whispers followed in her wake, some pitying, some frightened, some angry. The Omega who dared stand up to a merchant, the rejected mate who wouldn't fade away. Now she'd pay for her audacity. The council chamber was designed to intimidate. Vaulted ceilings, stone walls carved with the histories of Alpha Kings, a semicircle of elevated seats where the 5 elders sat in judgment. At the center stood a single chair for the accused. Elder Marcus presided, his expression carved from granite. "Fidelia, you stand accused of practicing forbidden magic, of attempting to manipulate a rejected mate bond, and of conspiracy to undermine the natural order of our realm. Those charges are absurd," Fidelia said, keeping her voice steady. "You were seen in the forest at moonrise, in the company of known practitioners of old Omega magic. Witnesses report unusual lights and energy." Marcus leaned forward. "Do you deny this?" Fidelia's mind raced. If she admitted to the training, they'd arrest Iris and Marin too. But if she lied, the phantom bond pulsed in her chest. And suddenly she understood. This wasn't about magic. This was about control. "I deny nothing," she said clearly, "because I've committed no crime. Omega magic isn't forbidden, you just pretend it doesn't exist." Murmurs rippled through the assembled witnesses. Omega magic was eradicated centuries ago, for the safety of all. Omega magic was suppressed, Fidelia interrupted, because it threatened your power. Because true Omegas can't be controlled, manipulated, or lied to, and that terrifies you. Marcus's eyes flashed with anger. "You dare. Where is Alpha King Snow?" Fidelia demanded. "You said he was informed. If I'm truly such a threat, why isn't he here to judge me himself?" "The Alpha King has recused himself from this proceeding due to the complicated nature of your previous connection," another elder said. He felt his judgment might be compromised. Translation: they'd convinced him to stay away, or threatened him with something worse if he interfered. The phantom bond ached in her chest, and Fidelia wondered if Snow could feel her fear, her anger, if some part of him was fighting to reach her even now. "The council finds you guilty," Marcus announced. "You will be exiled beyond the realm's borders immediately. Any attempt to return will result in execution." "This is murder by another name," Fidelia said. "Exiling an Omega alone, without resources. You should have thought of that before practicing forbidden arts." Marcus stood. "Guards, escort the prisoner." The council chamber doors slammed open. Alpha King Snow strode in, his jade eyes blazing with fury, his alpha presence so overwhelming that even the elders instinctively drew back. "This proceeding," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "is over." Snow had been in his study when the bond had suddenly flooded with Fidelia's fear. Not the phantom ache he'd grown accustomed to, but sharp, vivid terror that had driven him to his knees. Then he'd felt her defiance, her courage in the face of judgment, and he'd understood with perfect clarity that while he'd been wallowing in confusion, his counsel had moved against her, against his mate. His beta, Garrett, had tried to stop him. "Your Majesty, the council's authority. My authority supersedes theirs." Snow had snarled. "Always has. I just forgot that for a while." Now he stood in the council chamber, facing down the elders who'd manipulated him for years. "Alpha King," Marcus said carefully. "This matter doesn't concern. A member of my realm is being judged without proper representation or fair trial. That absolutely concerns me." Snow's eyes swept the room, landing on Fidelia. She looked exhausted but unbroken, her chin raised in that stubborn way that made his wolf howl with pride. "What are the charges?" "Practicing forbidden Omega magic. There's no law against Omega magic." I checked. Snow had spent the hours since Marcus's confession, tearing through the realm's legal codes, That law was proposed 3 centuries ago but never ratified. So unless you're admitting to enforcing illegal policies, there are no charges. The elders exchanged panicked glances. Furthermore, Snow continued, moving to stand beside Fidelia, even if such a law existed, the council lacks authority to exile citizens without my approval, which you don't have, which means this entire proceeding is unlawful. Your Majesty, Marcus said desperately, the Omega is dangerous. The Omega, Snow said, his voice dropping to something lethal, has a name, and you will use it. Or I'll find a new council who remembers that their role is to advise, not to rule. Silence fell like a hammer. Snow extended his hand to Fidelia. Come, you're free to go. Fidelia stared at his offered hand, strong, steady, the hand of an Alpha King who'd just publicly chosen her over his council. She placed her hand in his. The moment their skin touched, the phantom bond roared to life, stronger than ever, and the entire room felt the surge of power between them. The council had just lost their war, and they knew it. Snow didn't release Fidelia's hand as they left the council chamber. He led her through corridors lined with gaping servants and guards, his grip firm, his stride purposeful. The bond hummed between them, alive and insistent, and for the first time since the rejection, he wasn't fighting it. Where are we going? Fidelia asked, nearly running to keep pace with his longer stride. Somewhere we can talk without the council's spies listening. He brought her to a private garden tucked behind the palace's east wing, a place few knew existed. Ancient willow trees created a canopy overhead, and a small fountain burbled in the center. It had been his mother's sanctuary. Before she died, Snow finally released her hand, putting distance between them as if proximity might shatter his control. When he turned to face her, his expression was raw with emotions he'd spent weeks suppressing. I owe you an apology, he said. Fidelia blinked. Your Majesty. Snow. Just call me Snow. He ran a hand through his dark hair, frustrated. An Alpha King, who can't see when he's being manipulated, isn't much of a king, and I was blind. Deliberately blind. They lied to you. They told me what I wanted to hear, Snow corrected. That rejecting you was necessary. That Omegas were weak, that the bond would die cleanly, and I could move on. His jade eyes met hers, but none of it was true. The bond didn't die. You're not weak, and I can't move on, because every time I try, I feel you reaching through whatever connection still exists between us. Fidelia's breath caught. You felt the training. In the forest, I felt everything. Snow took a step closer. Your fear when the guards came, your defiance in the council chamber, and underneath it all, this power that shouldn't exist but does. Tell me what's happening to you. Fidelia hesitated. Trusting him felt dangerous. He'd rejected her once already, but the bond pulsed between them, and she felt his sincerity, his confusion, his desperate need to understand. Omega magic, she said quietly. It was never gone, just suppressed through centuries of forced breeding and blood manipulation. Iris, the old healer, she's been helping me awaken what my bloodline should have been. The ability to sense connections, to influence without commanding, to balance an alpha's power. Snow's voice was rough. That's what Marcus meant. That's what they feared. A true Omega bonded to an Alpha King becomes his equal, his partner, not his subordinate. Fidelia wrapped her arms around herself. The council couldn't control that, so they made sure you rejected me before the bond could fully form and trigger my awakening. Except the bond didn't break. No, Fidelia looked up at him. It didn't. Snow closed the remaining distance between them, stopping just inches away. Close enough that she could feel his warmth, smell the cedar and winter rain scent that made her wolf whimper with longing. I don't know how to fix what I broke, he admitted. I don't know if a rejected bond can be repaired or if trying would just cause more pain. But I know that watching the council try to destroy you made me realize something. What? That I'd rather burn this entire realm to the ground than let them hurt you again. His hand lifted, hesitating near her cheek. That rejection or not, bond or not, you're mine, and I'm going to protect you, even if you hate me for the rest of your life." Tears burned Fidelia's eyes. "I don't hate you. You should. Well, I don't." She caught his hand before he could pull away, pressing his palm to her cheek. The contact sent electricity through the bond, and they both gasped. "I hate what you did. I hate that you believed their lies. But I don't hate you." Snow's thumb brushed away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "What do you want?" Fidelia really want? She should want distance, safety, protection from the pain of another rejection. Instead, she wanted the impossible. "I want you to stop being afraid," she whispered, "of the bond." "I'm terrified," Snow admitted. "Everything they said about bonded true mates, that you'd control me, cloud my judgment, make me weak, is a lie designed to keep you isolated." Fidelia turned her face into his palm. "True mates don't weaken each other. They balance each other. Your strength, my intuition. Your power, my wisdom. Your command, my influence. The council won't accept it. They'll fight us every step. Then we fight back." Fidelia met his eyes. Together, Snow stared at her for a long moment. This Omega who should have been broken but refused to bend, who'd walked through fire and come out stronger. Then he made his choice. "I, Snow Blackthorn, Alpha King of the Silver Peak Realm, formally revoke my rejection of the mate bond between myself and Fidelia." The words rang with alpha command and something deeper, truth that resonated in the air itself. "I claim you as my mate, my equal, my Luna. If you'll have me." The bond exploded between them, no longer phantom or damaged, but whole and blazing with power. Fidelia gasped as her suppressed Omega magic surged to full awakening, silver light erupting from her skin. Snow caught her as her knees buckled, and when their eyes met again, hers glowed with lunar silver. "I accept," she breathed, the bond completed with a surge of power that shook the garden, sending ripples of energy across the entire realm. In the council chamber, Elder Marcus felt the bond snap into place and knew his worst nightmare had come true. The Alpha King had a true Omega mate, and there was nothing he could do to stop what came next. The bond completion sent shockwaves through the palace. Fidelia collapsed in Snow's arms as power flooded through her centuries of suppressed Omega magic, awakening all at once. Silver light poured from her skin, her eyes blazed lunar white, and through the bond she could feel everything Snow felt. His fierce protectiveness, his regret for the rejection, his absolute determination that nothing would separate them again. "I've got you," he murmured, holding her tight as the transformation ravaged her body. "I'm here." When the light finally faded, Fidelia looked up at him with eyes that still held traces of silver. "I can feel them. Everyone in the palace, their emotions, their intentions, their truth," she gasped. "Snow, the council, they're planning something. Right now." Snow's jaw clenched. "Can you tell what?" "Violence, desperation." Fidelia pressed her hand to her temple, overwhelmed by the flood of sensation. "They know what just happened. They felt the bond complete, and they're afraid of us." "Good," Snow growled. "They should be." He lifted her in his arms and strode back toward the palace. Guards scrambled out of his way, their eyes wide at the sight of their Alpha King carrying an Omega who glowed with barely contained power. "Your Majesty." Garrett intercepted them in the main corridor, his face grave. "The council has convened an emergency session. They're demanding your presence immediately. They're calling for—" He hesitated, glancing at Fidelia. "They're calling for your removal from the throne, claiming you've been compromised by dark magic. Let them call for whatever they want," Snow said coldly. "Assemble every pack leader, every warrior, every citizen who can fit in the throne room. This ends tonight." Within an hour, the throne room was packed. Snow sat on his throne, and for the first time in the realm's history, a second throne had been placed beside it, smaller, elegant, unmistakably equal. Fidelia sat there in borrowed finery, a simple silver circlet on her auburn hair, her presence radiating the quiet power of a true Omega. The council stood before them. Marcus at the center, his face twisted with barely controlled rage. "Alpha King Snow," Marcus began, his voice formal. "This council formally challenges your fitness to rule on the grounds of magical corruption. The Omega has used forbidden arts to manipulate the mate bond, to control your will. I revoked the rejection of my own free will," Snow interrupted. Every word spoken with clear mind and alpha command. No magic forced my choice. The Omega's power is exactly what Omega power should be, what you've been suppressing for 3 centuries. Snow stood, his presence filling the room. "I've spent the past hours reviewing the historical records you tried to bury. The truth about what Omegas were before your ancestors decided they were threats to control." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "True Omegas are balancers," Fidelia said, her voice carrying despite its softness. Through the bond, Snow felt her drawing on his strength, transforming it into influence that made everyone in the room lean forward to listen. "We sense truth from lies. Heal what's broken. See connections others miss. We don't control alphas, we complete them." "Lies," Marcus spat. "You've bewitched the king, then let her prove it," Snow challenged. "Fidelia, tell them what you sense from the council, the truth your Omega magic can see." Fidelia closed her eyes, reaching out with her newly awakened abilities. The bonds of emotion and intention lit up in her mind like silver threads, and she could follow each one to its source. What she found made her blood run cold. "Elder Marcus has been embezzling from the realm's treasury for 15 years, she said, opening her eyes. "Elder Thorn takes bribes from the Western Pax in exchange for favorable trade terms. Elder Cassia arranged the assassination attempt on Snow's father to clear her own son's path to a council seat." "Enough," Marcus roared. "These are baseless accusations. Then submit to a truth-binding ceremony," Snow said softly. "Ancient magic, approved by the old laws. If Fidelia lies, she'll die. If she speaks truth, you will." The color drained from Marcus's face. "Unless," Fidelia added gently, "you confess now. Truth-binding is painful. Confession is merciful." For a long moment, Marcus held his ground, then his shoulders sagged. "Everything we did," he said bitterly, "was to preserve order, to keep the realm stable, to prevent the chaos that comes when kings are ruled by emotions instead of logic." He looked at Snow with something almost like pity. "You'll understand eventually, when sentiment clouds your judgment and your kingdom suffers for it." "My judgment has never been clearer," Snow replied. "The council is hereby dissolved. You'll stand trial for your crimes, and this realm will be rebuilt on truth instead of manipulation." Guards moved forward to take the elders into custody. The crowd erupted, some cheering, some shocked, all transformed by what they'd witnessed. Snow turned to Fidelia, extending his hand. "Ready to rebuild a kingdom, my Luna?" Fidelia took his hand, the bond singing between them. That night, as the realm reeled from the revelations, Snow and Fidelia stood on the palace balcony overlooking the city lights. "They'll resist," Fidelia said quietly. "Change doesn't come easily. There are those who'll always believe Omegas should be weak. Then we'll show them otherwise." Snow pulled her close. "Starting with you. Tomorrow, you'll be formally crowned Luna Queen. Not my subordinate, my equal. The realm isn't ready. The realm will adjust." He tilted her chin up, his jade eyes fierce. "I rejected you once because I was afraid. I won't make that mistake again. You're mine, Fidelia, and I'm yours. Let anyone who has a problem with that try to separate us." Fidelia smiled, rising on her toes to kiss him. The bond flared between them, warm and whole and unbreakable. Far below, in the cells, Marcus stared at his shackled hands and wondered how everything had gone so wrong. He'd tried to suppress the Omega. Instead, he'd created a Luna Queen who would reshape the realm, and there was nothing left but to watch her rise. The coronation took place under a full moon, as tradition demanded. The throne room had been transformed. Where once only alphas and high-ranking wolves had stood witness, now Omegas lined the walls alongside betas and warriors. Marin stood near the front, tears streaming down her weathered face. Iris watched from the shadows, her mismatched eyes glowing with satisfaction. Fidelia wore a gown of deep emerald that brought out the silver flecks in her eyes that had never fully returned to their original brown after her awakening. The omega marks of power shimmered faintly on her skin. Silver threads that traced her collarbone, her wrists, visible proof of what she'd become. Snow stood beside her in formal black armor, the wolf insignia on his chest now intertwined with a silver omega symbol. A public declaration that their bond was equal. The high priestess, brought from the sacred grove specifically for this ceremony, raised her hands. "The moon has chosen," she intoned, her ancient voice carrying through the packed room. This bond was torn apart and reformed stronger. This omega was suppressed and awakened more powerful. This alpha rejected his mate and learned that true strength is knowing when you were wrong. She turned to Fidelia. "Do you, Fidelia of the outer villages, accept the responsibility of Lunar Queen, to lead beside your mate as an equal, to protect the weak, challenge injustice, and use your awakened power for the good of all?" "I do." Fidelia's voice was steady, carrying the quiet confidence she'd earned through survival and transformation. "And do you, Snow Blackthorn, Alpha King of the Silver Peak realm, accept your true mate as your equal, to rule beside her, not above her, to honor her counsel, respect her power, and build a kingdom where strength and balance walk hand in hand?" "I do." Snow's jade eyes never left Fidelia's face. Gladly, the high priestess placed a silver crown on Fidelia's head, delicate but strong, woven with lunar symbols and omega runes. "Then, by the moon's blessing and this realm's witness, I declare you Lunar Queen. May your reign bring the balance we have been denied for far too long." The room erupted in applause, not polite, obligatory clapping, but genuine celebration. The Omegas cheered loudest, finally seeing one of their own, elevated not as a token, but as true power. Snow took Fidelia's hand and led her to the dual thrones. They sat together, and for the first time in 3 centuries, the Silver Peak realm had both an Alpha King and a Lunar Queen of equal authority. The celebrations lasted through the night, but Snow and Fidelia eventually escaped to the private gardens where they'd first repaired their bond. "How does it feel?" Snow asked, pulling her close under the willow trees. "Being Lunar Queen? Terrifying," Fidelia admitted. "I still remember being the invisible Omega who mended clothes in silence. Now I'm supposed to lead a realm." "You already were leading," Snow said. "You just didn't realize it. When you stood up to that merchant for the starving girl, when you faced the council without flinching, when you refused to break even when I gave you every reason to." He kissed her forehead. "You've been a leader all along. Now, you just have the title to match." Fidelia leaned into him, feeling the bond pulse between them warm, whole, unshakable. "Do you regret it? Revoking the rejection? Everything that came after?" "My only regret," Snow said quietly, "is that I didn't see your worth from the beginning, that I let fear and manipulation blind me to what was right in front of me." He tilted her chin up, his expression fierce. "But I see you now, Fidelia, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of being your mate. You already are." She kissed him, the bond singing between them. "We both made mistakes. We both learned. That's what makes us stronger." In the weeks that followed, the realm began to change. Fidelia established schools for Omega children, teaching them not submission but confidence. She created councils where Omegas could bring grievances directly to the throne. She personally investigated every case of Omega abuse, and those found guilty faced swift justice. Snow backed every decision, his Alpha command reinforcing her authority. Together, they were formidable, his raw power balanced by her intuitive wisdom, his dominance tempered by her compassion. The other packs watched with mixture of fear and fascination. Some sent delegations, curious about this new model of leadership. Others prepared for resistance. But slowly, inevitably, the old ways began to crumble. One afternoon, 6 months after the coronation, Fidelia stood in the throne room, addressing a group of young Omegas who'd been rescued from an abusive pack in the Northern Territory. "You were told you were weak," she said, her silver-touched eyes meeting each of theirs. "That you were meant to serve, to submit, to disappear, but that was a lie designed to keep you powerless." She gestured to the dual thrones behind her. "True Omegas are balancers, healers, truth-seers. We are not weak. We were made weak by those who feared our strength." A young girl, no more than 12, raised her hand tentatively. "But how do we become strong? If we've been weak our whole lives," Fidelia smiled. "The same way I did. One choice at a time. One moment of courage. One refusal to be invisible when everything tells you to hide." She knelt to the girl's level. "You start by believing you matter, and then you prove it." That night, as Snow and Fidelia prepared for bed, he watched her remove the lunar crown and set it carefully on its stand. "I was thinking," he said casually, "about the Western packs. Their Alpha King has requested an audience. He wants to discuss Omega reforms." Fidelia turned, eyebrows raised. "Reforms? Apparently, his own mate is Omega. He's kept it quiet for years, ashamed. But after hearing about you..." Snow pulled her close. "He wants to know if change is possible in his realm too." "It's possible anywhere," Fidelia said. "It just takes one person brave enough to start, or one Omega stubborn enough to refuse to stay broken." Snow corrected, kissing her, even when her own mate rejected her, especially then. Fidelia smiled against his lips. "Because I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for every Omega who'd ever been told they were worthless." "And you won," Snow murmured. "You won everything. We won," Fidelia corrected. Years later, historians would write about the Lunar Queen who transformed a realm, who proved that Omegas weren't weak, just suppressed, who stood beside her Alpha King as a true equal, and changed the fate of their entire species. But in that moment, under the moon's silver light, Snow and Fidelia were simply two wolves who'd found their way back to each other, despite every obstacle thrown in their path. He'd rejected her as an Omega, believing her beneath him. She'd risen as a Lunar Queen, becoming exactly what he needed. And together, they'd rebuilt a kingdom on truth instead of fear. The moon had chosen well. The end. If you loved Snow and Fidelia's journey from rejection to redemption, let me know in the comments. Subscribe for more powerful stories.